Today, guys, I'm going to walk you through how to make graphs using Microsoft Excel. And so our graphs, remember, graphs always have a couple of components here that we need to always ensure there. They need to have a title. They need to have appropriately labeled X and Y axes. And they also need to make sure that you start at the appropriate values. There are certain times where you would need a key for certain graphs, but at a minimum, we need to have a graph title. We need to have appropriately labeled X and Y axes with units, and then make sure that those X and Y values start and end at the appropriate places. So I'm going to walk you through here how to make a simple scatter plot using Microsoft Excel. And so here's a data sheet that I very simply created here, but this would pretend this is data that we just collected in our laboratory session. And so we have time, speed, oxygen consumption, or VO2 max, or VO2. Sorry, I'm going to actually take off VO2 max there to make it a little more accurate. VO2. We have systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and our heart rate. And so we're going to start off our first graph. I'm going to give you an example of here. Let's say we want to graph how oxygen consumption responds to changes in speed of the treadmill. And so our independent variable, that is the variable that goes on our x-axis that we as researchers manipulate, is speed. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the cursor and I'm going to highlight speed. All right? And I want to see how does oxygen consumption respond to changes in speed. So VO2 is our dependent variable, meaning it is dependent on what we as researchers manipulate. And so then I'm going to also highlight this VO2 column, but I'm going to press Control and highlight that column. So now I have both columns highlighted. I have speed and VO2. All right. And so I'm going to insert, insert and XY scatter. All right. And I want my lines to be connected with, my points to be connected with smooth lines here. So that's the first thing that we get. We have, this is what pops up in Excel. All right. And so this is not everything that we need. What we're missing here, we're missing labeled y-axis, we're missing a labeled x-axis, and I'm going to actually make my screen here, make this a little bit bigger, see if I can give you guys a little more view. All right, so there's this is what pops up once we make this graph. All right, and so here's what we need to add. You see this little plus sign? We're going to add some chart elements. So to add, and actually let me make this a little bit bigger because I don't think that you guys can see it yet, and I'll slide this graph over some. All right, so we're going to add some chart elements. We want axis titles, all right, and we want, that's actually good for now, but if you wanted to label your data, which it's not required and you don't need to do that, if you wanted error bars, if you did need a key, right, we can add a key at this point, or if there needed to be a trend line. Right? But we don't need all of those things. So we have everything we need here. We've got our title, we have our y-axis, and we have our x-axis. All right. So for our graph title, we want to make sure that our title appropriately reflects what we're actually looking at. And so we can come up with something fancy, or it can be very, very simple. The simplest way to make a graph title is simply your y variable versus your x variable. And so in this case, we're going to say oxygen consumption versus speed. Right now, you could put something like how does oxygen consumption respond to changes in treadmill speed, or oxygen consumption relative to changes in treadmill speed, or something like that. Or we could simply go oxygen consumption versus speed. Then we need to appropriately label our y-axis. And so our y-axis is VO2, and we want to make sure that we include our units. So milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute of time. Our x-axis is speed of the treadmill in miles per hour. And so we have our appropriately labeled graph here. So we have our graph title. We have our y-axis appropriately labeled with units, so VO2 in milliliters per kilogram per minute. And then we have speed on the x-axis. Right? And so that was a very simple graph. Now I'm going to show you a couple more here and a few other things that we may need to look at. So I'm actually just going to delete this graph. All right. Now let's say we wanted to do heart rate versus time. All right. And so again, we're going to highlight our time. We are going to hit Control and highlight heart rate. All right. We go to Insert, Scatter Plot, all right, with smooth lines. So we click on that, and it produces our graph right here. And so again, we will add our chart elements. So let's add axis titles. All right, and that's all we need for now. So again, let's now change our title. Heart rate versus time. Our y-axis here is heart rate in beats per minute. Our x-axis here is time in minutes. All right. So there's that. Now, one thing I do want to make note of here. If we look at the values here on our y-axis, it's starting at 0 going up to 250. That is a really wide range. And so one of the things I want you guys to make sure of is that we start and finish at the appropriate values on each axis. And so what I want to do is I'm going to change my starting and finishing values, as well as the units that the incremental increases there, or the incremental units of increase of the y-axis. So I click on the y-axis, so left click, and then I'm going to right click to format the axis. And so here you can see our lowest heart rate that we recorded was, I believe it was 48 beats per minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start the y-axis at 40. Right? Our highest heart rate, I believe, was 192, and so you can see it actually automatically changed the maximum value to 200, and so that gives us a smaller range, and it also adjusted the increments from 50 to 20. So what I want to make sure that you guys do is you start and you finish at the appropriate values based on the data that you've collected. Right? If your heart rate range is 100 to 150 beats per minute, well, there's no reason to start at 0 and end at 200. Narrow that range down so that you get a better picture of how that variable responded, how that dependent variable responded to our independent variable. Okay. So that's it for today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me, call me, talk to me in class to get a little better understanding. Now, one thing I will add, different versions of Microsoft Excel have different buttons, whether you have an older version, newer version, whether you have a Mac. So there may be some slight differences here, but what needs to be included on these graphs are all the same.